The soldier, above all others, prays for peace, for it is the soldier who must suffer and bear the deepest wounds and scars of war. General Douglas MacArthur. That's as true today as it was when MacArthur said it. And yet, in the midst of violence and destruction of war, we can see heroism, endurance, and willpower that goes beyond the call of duty. They lived by the sword, and they died by the sword. They followed the warrior's way. The Celts, a people without a nation or a king, a network of warring tribes that only ever united when fighting a common enemy. Maybe they weren't barbarians, but they sure did fight an awful lot. What would it have taken to be a leader of men in such a warrior society? Drustin, the man who would be chief, is born in what today is the Czech Republic in the 4th century BCE. Referred to as Latin culture, this was a high point for the Celtic peoples. Despite continually fighting among themselves and never uniting as a people under one leader, 2,300 years ago, the Celts occupied vast amounts of territory across Europe and even the Middle East. From the grave of a Celtic warrior found in Michikvosti, Bohemia, in the modern-day Czech Republic in Central Europe, we can try to reconstruct what his life might have been like.
One of the things that has developed, especially since the 20th century, although there was a huge find also in the 17th century, are the Celtic remains, bodies that have been inhumed in graves with grave goods. And so not only do we see the stature of the bodies and perhaps some of the wounds that may have done them in, but we also have a very, very nice array of weapons and defensive armaments. Sometimes foodstuffs and preparations, maybe even a horse and maybe even a boat.
The archaeologists have been able to deduce quite a lot about this corpse, dead before he turned 40. Well, that was pretty typical for this era. Be that as it may, he was definitely someone of importance. We know because he was buried in his fine cloak. We would like to think he might have been a Celtic chieftain.
The males, there could have been the warriors of the so-called warrior class elite. This social class is quite wide. It accounts for almost 20% of the that time society, and those account for males being buried with their weapons. And those weapons, this is the whole military equipment, which counts with swords, with spear, and with shield, and with the personal ornaments. What we can infer from these burials is, of course, the age when the so-called or alleged warrior has died, if it has become due to some military or violent encounter, or as if he has died from the natural causes. And surprisingly, he mostly did.
Celtic warriors get their official reputation from nobody but their opponents. They don't write. We don't have much knowledge about what they thought of themselves, but we know that the people who fought against them didn't like fighting against them. They defeat the Romans when the Romans don't think anybody can defeat them.
Celtic warriors on the attack are as ferocious a band of killers as ever existed, or at least that was their reputation. There is no doubt they were brutal in combat, but so were many other warrior creeds.
They have been labeled as the boasters and threateners, and very fearsome warriors, which without any kind of warrior ethic or ethos beside their own, without any rules, and with very strong feeling for the personal individual bravery. So that's the general image they've got. So this may give you an idea how they were looked and described by the classical authors as well.
Part legend, part historical fact. The image of the Celtic warrior has stayed with us through the centuries. If the legends have any truth to them, Celtic warriors certainly looked the part. Some were tattooed, and the Celts of legend had their bodies painted in blue woad. Some even fought buck naked.
The Celts, especially in some parts of Europe, for example, in what is nowadays Scotland, so they used to depict themselves, not to paint themselves with these bluish colors. So for this reason, they were named Picti, the painted ones, by the Romans. So all these elements put together highlight how the Celtic warriors used to appear as something completely different to the eyes of the Romans and also to the eyes of the Greeks.
Perhaps what made the Celts so fearsome, at least in the minds of others, was their independence. And we must reserve judgment and recall that history is written by the victorious.
Later on, when they have been fighting for their territories back with Romans, the emphasis has been put on how great the Roman victories against them were, so they needed, again, be described as fearsome and very dangerous enemy, but obviously mortal and ultimately being defeated by the Romans.
Sometimes it's believed women, she-devils, accompanied them into battle and may have even fought beside them. This sort of thing could send a shiver down the spine of many a Roman or Greek who considered the Celts barbarians. And it wasn't just down to appearances. The Celts deserved their reputation for violence and ferocity. But recently, the Celts' place in history has been undergoing a bit of revision. The Celts were all fine craftspeople who granted their women more rights and all that. Well, maybe so, but it's Celtic warriors we're interested in, male or female, and the more warlike, the better.
They were really aggressive, really unrefined as well, so their nature as military beings, their nature as warriors was completely different from that of more civilized and more technically oriented armies.
All cultures, all people, they evolve in time. And same as that, the Latin culture, Latin civilization as we called it, it evolved from the 4th century when we encountered them fighting against the Romans on the capital, to the 1st century when they are disappearing from the archaeological record in Central Europe.
It's said that the blacksmith, the druid, and the poet were all valued in Celtic lore for the roles they played in warfare. The druids for reading omens, the poets for composing battle songs, and the blacksmith for making weapons. This is Drustan's father, Gobin, a man of good standing in the tribe. He has come to pick out a sword for his son. He wants the best for his boy, and the day has come to order a sword from the blacksmith, a man he's known for many years. He carefully chooses which sword will be Drustan's first. The craftsmen who made those beautiful Celtic weapons were highly prized, somewhere between alchemists and magicians.
Metallurgists were seen as something we would call shamans because they worked with fire and had access to procedures and technologies that were inaccessible to ordinary people. We know that from many sources, both written and archaeological. For example, in Semitic languages, at the place where iron smithing actually originated, the verbs forge and sing have the same origin, which implies that the blacksmiths recited or sang some magical formulas during their work, which were almost certainly in verses, and very much shows how close the cult efforts of the blacksmiths and their craftsmanship were. In short, work with fire was related to the cult of all early civilizations, and the Celts were no exception. The production of one blade takes me about 100 to 200 hours of work, but of that work, the sword is about half or a third, and the rest is pre-preparation of the material, which was previously done by someone other than the sword, possibly since the early Middle Ages, but definitely by the Middle Ages. So if we wanted to say how much work there was to produce one sword from, say, melt to final product, one blade could take hundreds of hours.
We can't say that they were highly valued, or at least that were valued more than the other skilled craftsmen. We know that in the Latin culture, in the later Iron Age, they were very skilled bronze makers, making magnificent things. They were impeccably skilled glass makers, doing personal ornaments.
Treat yourself to the best gift in history this holiday season. Enjoy unlimited access to award-winning podcasts and thousands of hours of original history documentaries released weekly exclusively on History Hit. There are topics for all history lovers, from Pompeii to D-Day. Sign up via the link in the description for an exclusive discount. Don't miss out on this incredible opportunity to explore the past like never before with History Hit.
Swords play a big part in Celtic mythology and spirituality. Just think of Arthur and Excalibur.
The Latin swords are very beautiful. It can be said that the Celtic feeling of beauty, as we can observe those artifacts, including swords, was very similar to ours. Regarding the decoration, plant ornaments and various symbols used by the Celts, they are very similar to our Art Nouveau, which is about 100 years old, and therefore they seem close to us with their preference for nature, which in fact, only with modern times is again in our minds.
The Celts also used different weapons as well. They had long, thin spearheads that would be on the end of spears, or maybe even what we would call lances, although they were never as long as the Greeks. They had weapons that they would attach to clubs, we would later call maces. And certain groups, especially those that were found in Gaul, had these throwing axes that were quite fun. They were oddly shaped and they were perfectly weighted, and they loved to throw them at a great distance. Couldn't be the length of an arrow, for example, but at a medium difference, as they're closing in on the Romans, they would heave one or two of these throwing axes into the Romans, and if nothing else, they'd get stuck in the shields and weigh the Roman shields down. Most often they made it through, and in that case, they would penetrate pretty much anything the Romans were wearing.
The Celtic throwing axe probably doesn't get its due. Can you imagine how much practice it took to throw it so it hit its target right? And yet, when people think of the Celtic weapons, it is usually a sword or a dagger that springs to mind. It's important to understand, these weapons were seen as merely tools of the trade. Some took the way of the plow and the sheath, and some picked up an axe and a sword. and followed the warrior's way. Whether on the battlefields or in the pastures, a Celt's tools were the clearest indicator of his or her social standing.
What we have here is a very distinct social class of men with weapons and women with very fine jewelry, and then the rest of the population, which is the remaining 60 to 80% of people, which were living their probably normal agricultural-based life.
The Celts made weapons that were minor works of art, setting them apart from the other weapons of this period. But not every Celt got to use weapons of such quality. Drustin is lucky to have a father who can afford to buy him such a fine sword. The young man will soon find out how hard he must work to earn such a gift. When Drustin is still a boy, he is presented with his first real sword, double-edged and super sharp. The Celtic sword was as handsome as it was deadly. Much is made in popular histories of warriors and their trusty swords, but the Celts were one of the few warrior creeds whose weapons and armaments were genuine treasures, works of art. Consider the Celtic shield, like the sword, a thing of beauty, as well as having great practical use. Celtic warriors depended on their shields almost as much as their weapons.
One of the nice things about studying the Celts, and again, we usually do it only from the perspective of them fighting the Romans, is that their artwork is somewhat different. Romans have big, grand artwork, pretty much, I guess, exemplifying the big, grand empire that was the Romans. The Celts were much smaller, much floral, animalistic, all these other motifs that were put, and they were great metalsmiths. Their swords, which were, of course, metal, the hilts of their swords would be immaculately decorated.
From the material evidence, we know that the warrior military equipment consisted mostly of a sword, of a spear, and of a shield. Then shield was mostly organic, so what we find mostly is iron reinforcement of the piece where your fist would have been and of the edges. What we know also, and this is very interesting to say, that this military equipment was standardized according to the military customs of that era, to the way of fighting. But on the contrary, they were very individualized according to the personality of the bearer. So you wouldn't probably find two same weapons on the same cemetery in the same area, in the whole territory of the Latin culture. You can find very similar weapons, but not two exactly the same. This is probably due to the thing that the weapons were very personal to their owner, and they stayed with him for his whole life. So sometimes you can encounter very large swords, for example, or very little swords, very large spears or very little of them, and different kinds of shapes of shields as well.
Like all Celtic warriors, young Drustin must learn how to use this sword and other weapons while still a lad. And as you can see, his father is a hard taskmaster. But we must remember that this is a tough world. Drustin is a natural anyway, the kind of kid that looks forward to the day when he has grown up and can show the old man a thing or two. Well, some things never change.
We don't know a lot about the Celtic youth. We don't know a lot about Celtic home life, actually. All of that comes from excavations. Even Tacitus, who writes a great book on the Germans, the Celts of his day, doesn't tell us a lot about the young. But we do know that from a very early age, a Celtic boy was raised in the use of arms, probably using wooden replicas initially, although none of these have been found in graves. And their skills and techniques, their education would be placed in that area. But by and large, they just grew up with the weapons and they knew to defend against wild animals, against opposing forces, and sometimes against a Roman or two.
Droustin changes from boy to man and already has his work cut out for him. He will fight as a soldier for hire on foreign soil. He begins making a name for himself as a brave, resourceful soldier and good fellow to know. Generally, he chooses his opponents well. Then again, this is a dangerous life. Chainmail saves his life in combat more than once.
The invention of a chainmail, in the continent at least, is being attributed to the Celts. And they were very precise in their construction because the pieces, the individual rings, were connected by little rivets, which were reinforcing the whole structure. And this is counted as a Celtic invention, actually. But can you imagine joining all the circles or the rings? That might take a lifetime for you to create one such a chainmail. That's why it has been limited only to the highest members of elite to wear such a chainmail.
Roman scribes, including Livy and Varro, all mention that the Celts used chainmail. Varro states explicitly that the Celts invented it. The Celts also wore linothorax, a type of armor created from leather, linen, and felt. So it was that the Celts, these illiterate barbarians, created the finest armor of their age and forced their enemies to change tactics.
The Romans had to change their weapons when they encountered the Celts. Their own weapons were small swords that they thrust, things we call gladius. A gladius is a thrusting sword. It's not very long, and it's used mostly to be used behind a shield. The Celts were on horseback, and so their swords were longer, and the Romans actually had to develop swords that were longer to make sure that they could hit the Celts in their saddles, because the Celts would actually fight with these swords that were a bit longer and could reach down. If the Romans couldn't reach up, then that meant there was only death on one side.
The quiet life was definitely not for the Celts. Droustin embodies that warrior spirit. He can see clearly that in the world in which he lives, being a skilled practitioner in the ways of war is almost the only way to get ahead in life. After all, the many Celtic fiefdoms and tribes fought constantly among themselves for centuries.
Who exactly the Celts were is defined by the Romans. They seem to be all over Europe. The Celts of Britain fought pretty much the Celts of Britain. If there was somebody who had the capability, maybe a French group that had the capability going across the Channel, then they would fight. If it was one from Ireland, they would fight. But otherwise, it was one group on this forest, one group on that forest, and they would fight against each other over whatever, we don't know.
Celts were at war among themselves, because we need to highlight also this aspect. The Celtic world was never a unified type of world from the political point of view. So the Celtic entity, or the Celtic ecumene, as we could say, used to be divided, split into several factions, into several tribes. And so very often these tribes were at war one against the other. But also, the striking point from here is that these Celts used to spread all over continental Europe from one side to the other, east to west, and also onto the British Isles.
Only in the face of a mighty common enemy would the warring Celts unite to defeat their territories. From the 4th century BCE, these included the Dacians, Germanic tribes, Greeks, and Macedonians, including the most famous Macedonian of all, Alexander the Great. But the Celtic world's arch-enemy was the Roman Empire. The Celts sacked the city of Rome in 390 BCE, a humiliation neither forgiven nor forgotten by the Romans, who remained at war with the Celts for the next 400 years. They invaded Germania, Gaul, and finally Britannia. The Romans could subdue the Celts for long periods of time, but they could never crush their rebellious spirit.
So let's say that at least from the year 390 before Common Era, when Brennus managed to defeat the Roman troops at the Battle of the Alli and then to sack Rome, which was a huge kind of outrage for that important city, Rome, developing as a republic. From that time, the Celts had numerous encounters with the Romans with different kind of consequences. It's also true that basically in the 2nd century before Common Era, the Romans started to develop a very specific and tailored anti-Celtic strategy. So they began to push the Celtic tribes up to the north and even farther beyond the Alps.
So Rome, after the Second Punic War, that means in 219, turned their attention back to the territories they have lost to Celts 200 years before, or 150 at least. And they started offensive campaigns against Celts with the purpose of adjacing the territories in the northern Italy back to Rome. And they have succeeded after several years of military campaigns. And the local Celts that were settling there were being either killed off, subordinated, or mostly turned away from the territory. So there was a matter of an existence and something which they were fighting for.
It takes luck and all his speed and skill as a warrior to survive. But Drustin survives life on the frontier and finally returns home from his battles against the marauding Romans. Older, tougher, and a little richer from the spoils of war, he brings with him gruesome trophies from his victims. Their heads. To take someone's head was to absorb all the strength of the fallen enemy. But was headhunting really so common in the Celtic world?
We have quite the difficulties of finding an evidence of warriors actually taking heads of their enemies. But we have one very interesting example. It's in today's France as well. It's in Champagne, I believe, and it's called Ribemont-sur-Ancre. It's a site in France, probably a site of an ancient battlefield when the army of the defeated was on a display on some wooden construction. And archaeologists have found many dozens of corpses, and those corpses were headless. So their heads were severed, they were taken away, and the rest of the corpses were mounted on a certain sort of a wooden kind of a display.
Legend has it the Celts would tie the heads of their enemies around their waists before going into battle. But that may be one tall tale too far.
A head is what, 10 pounds, 20 pounds, probably 10 pounds. Let's put 20 heads around you. You got 200 pounds around your waist now. You're going to go in battle with 200 pounds around your waist? Probably not. So the Romans may have been making this whole thing up, or they may have seen individuals within who were making this as a parade, as theater against them to show, look, this is what we've killed, and by the way, don't you see your brother Sam is there? Something along those lines, because they wanted the Romans to go away. The Romans want to fight them, they probably took that belt off.
It takes a bit of imagination and a strong stomach to consider how a society that believed the head to be something sacred could also cut them off and stick them on pikes. Violence bled through into so many aspects of Celtic life. Even the Celts' spiritual leaders practiced it. The Druids are believed to have presided over not only animal, but human sacrificial rites. This is the Mishik head, a sculpture found at the same site as Drusten's grave. The tonsure, the bald strip on his skull, indicates that he was probably a Druid, the Celtic holy man.
The Druids constitute a very specific social class within the context of the Celtic world. So they were many things at the same time. They were a sacerdotal class, so they were basically priests, mainly dealing with the forces of nature, with the trees, especially with the oak trees, more specifically. They could also be sort of masters, also poets sometimes. I mean, so they were related to all that was intangible, spiritual. So they took care of that side of human life for the Celts, I would say. So also because of this, because of other maybe stories or mythologies, such as the ones referring to human sacrifices, for example, the Druids were seen pretty much with suspicion by the Romans, for example, who managed to wipe them out from the face of the Celtic world.
Forest ring forts and stone oppidums were the fortified compounds where settled Celtic tribes lived together. This ring of trees is the remains of a ring fort in western Bohemia, officially called Česká Hořice. Remains like this may not be as majestic as a ruined medieval castle, but oppidums or ring forts were strategically located and built to withstand enemy onslaughts. Česká Hořice was inhabited during the late period of Latin culture, the 2nd century before the Common Era. It became part of the Amber Road, the commercial traveler's route of the Celtic world. This is where Drusten grew up and where all his dreams of becoming a great chieftain began.
An oppidum, as we know it from the continental Europe, has a very typical and very specific form of fortification. The fortification consists of a stone-facing wall with the upright wooden beams and the earthen rampart which is adjacent to it from the back. And with the stone-facing wall, the rampart is being connected by the horizontally laid beams.
Because there was so much warfare, and because so many people were raiders versus actual farmers and maybe even hunter-gatherers, there needed to be some protection. And the easiest protection to build was an earthen rampart. You put wood on top of it, and that would help make it larger, but a wooden rampart created both a ditch in front of it and a wooden wall.
Following his bloody skirmishes with the Romans, Drusten turns his attention closer to home. After showing himself to be a dab hand at slaughtering their foreign enemies, he needs to cement his position and prestige by imposing his will on his nearby neighbors. After all, every fighting man's body needs a head. He may never become a Bren or a Vercingetorix, but Drusten will be a leader of men, no matter who stands in his way. Vercingetorix, Caratacus, Bren, they were all great Celtic warriors and chieftains. But the most famous warrior from the Roman Celtic Wars is a woman, Boudica. The story goes that Boudica, or Boudica, both are correct, was the Celtic queen who, in 1st century CE, led a lightning-speed guerrilla campaign against the Roman Empire.
But it is also something interesting that once you actually manage to defeat the Celts, they never really surrender for good. So they always manage to find another solution.
After Boudica's chieftain husband died, she had expected the Romans to respect her status as his widow. But Nero, the infamous Roman emperor, had other plans for her. Instead of providing security, the Romans seized her lands, stole from all her chieftains. They even had Boudica flogged while they raped her daughters. Boudica swore vengeance. Waiting until the Roman governor was absent, she raised a rebel army which, between 60 and 61 CE, destroyed Roman fortifications in London, Colchester, and St. Albans, killing an estimated 80,000 people.
Boudica is, from the historical point of view, a remarkable figure of a female warrior, for sure. So she dared to confront herself and the Iceni tribe, which was her tribe, her ethnicity, with the Romans. So she was brave enough to put together and to start a revolt against the Romans once the Romans actually showed that they wanted to conquer the territory of the Iceni tribe after the death of Boudica's husband, Prasutagus. So she was a remarkable figure of a female warrior. She was a leader. She was very strong. The description that we get from the historian Cassius Dio she was tall, she had this fierce eyesight, she was very strong and very brave for sure. So the Romans were almost terrorized by her. And at the head of the revolt, she managed to conquer, to almost destroy 2 or 3 Roman cities, among which we can list also London, Londinium.
The end came when Governor Paulinus met and routed Boudica's rebel army at a point near present-day Milton Keynes. To avoid capture and further indignities at the hands of the Romans, Boudica and her daughters took poison. But even in defeat, her legend grew. She had shown that Rome could be defeated and had cemented her legend as the greatest of all female warriors.
Boadicea rides in a chariot, there's no question. I've seen it at all monuments. There's tons of monuments to her all throughout England. She's riding in a chariot. Actually, we do know that chariots were prolific at the time. There would have been no way that she would have ridden anything else. In fact, the strange thing is that the British are using chariots when they're long gone from the Roman society. Romans are either riding horses or they're in carts. For Boadicea to ride in a chariot, that's something. Somewhere along the line, and I don't think it was the Romans, but somewhere along the line said, you know what? Those scythe chariots that the Persians had in the Bible, that must have been what she was using up in England.
And Boudica was not the only one. A Celtic grave in the Czech Republic was found to be that of a woman buried with her sword. Only celebrated warriors were buried with their weapons and shields. The sword was worn on a belt around her waist, suggesting it might not have been a ceremonial weapon.
This is a female grave from the 3rd century BC. And we know she was a female because we have the anthropological evidence, we have genetic evidence. And we also know, and we saw that she was buried in a full female costume, which was very rich for that era. But she had a sword. And this is a very exceptional find. And we cannot quite safely interpret what happened. Maybe she carried the sword of her dead husband. Maybe she inherited the sword from her father. Maybe she took upon herself to perform some social roles suited for the warriors or for men, and this reflected as a presence of a sword in her grave. But we cannot say for sure whether she herself was engaged in military encounters.
The woman was about 50 years old when she died and apparently spent a lot of time on horseback. She was also buried with some exquisite Celtic jewelry, which had come all the way from France. But though there are one or two honored Celtic women warriors, it is the Celtic men who were expected to literally fight all the time, even while feasting. We find Drustin a bit older and meaner than the last time he was here, in another staring contest with an old tormentor and rival for the chieftain's throne. His rival is being honored with the heroes portion of the feast. Their eyes divert to the mound of food in the middle of the table, a veritable Celtic feast, or Curadmere as it's known in Celtic. The heroes portion, or the lion's share. This was the best cut of meat, the choicest part of the feast, and it was given to the bravest of the brave at a victory feast. But worth fighting and maybe dying for? You be the judge.
So we have written accounts that they were fighting at feasts. They were fighting over piece of meat. They were fighting over anything, basically, according to the written sources. So it's a matter of the personal courage, of a personal standing, the way how you treat your opponent, how bravely you treat your opponent, how you react to the conflict as well. And these all encounters has a very binding set of rules which were connected to the rituals, obviously.
Celts have their own legends, but they seem to be written by somebody else. And they tell us that honor is the most important thing among a warrior. This is not unusual. When we see elite forces, the warrior's way, if you will. The warrior's way is that you go out on battle and you do what the Spartan mother says to her son. Either you come back with your shield or on it.
It is easy to imagine how fighting for the heroes portion, or Curadmere, could be a dangerous, foolhardy enterprise. The loser could also bring disgrace upon himself and his kin. On the other hand, in this warrior society, winning the Curadmere could help make a man's reputation. And fortune, as they say, favors the bold. In this case, Drustin is the winner. He has won the hero's portion. But where can this happy warrior go from here? Like all Celtic warriors, he has only a short time to realize his ultimate ambition.
Well, that's a thing. We are talking about a very short period of time, in fact, where the Celts, as we can call them, were in offensive. It was the beginning of the so-called Celtic expansion, which took place from the beginning of the 4th century BC. We do not know what happened in the original territory. The original territory spanned across Central Europe, basically, the southern part of Germany, Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia and parts of Austria and Hungary. This is the area which is associated with the so-called Hallstatt culture from the early Iron Age between the 8th and the 4th century BC.
Drustin was lucky enough to live during what was a golden age for the Celts in Central Europe. when the tribes flourished. But the Romans and later Germanic tribes would soon once again be at his gates.
One of the most curious things about studying pre-modern society and warfare is how much there was. Most of these guys fought about little things. I mean, we're not talking about Alexander the Great going all the way to the end of the world. We're not talking about the Mongols sweeping across Asia and into Europe and in the Middle East. We're not talking about crusaders on their way to free the Holy Land, so to speak. We're not even talking about the Romans making a huge empire. We're talking about tribes on this side of the lake going around and beating up on tribes on the other side of the lake. And why? Who knows? Is the fishing better in the middle? Are they having problems with that? We have no idea. But it seems that men cannot be at peace for whatever reason, that you have to fight over some sort of aspect. And what is the aspects that we fight over now? Probably the same that we fight over then. Religious aspects, economic aspects, sexual aspects. Everybody's fighting everybody for whatever reason. And you want to say, you're both the same people. Can't you get along?
In a few years, the Celtic Druid presides over Drustan's initiation ceremony as chief. He has become tribal chieftain, not exactly by winning a scrap over the hero's portion at dinner, but by being more aggressive, more territorial, and more ruthless than his rivals. Let him revel in it, since he won't have long to enjoy it. We can't say for sure how our Czech Celtic warrior chieftain would have lived out the rest of his days. But we do know he would have defended his homeland to his very last breath. Ironically, some 500 years later, it would be the fall of the Roman Empire that would signal the beginning of the end for the Celtic peoples. But give them their due. They had had a long and glorious ride in the warrior's way.